Similarly, Democrats from across the state are in Milwaukee this weekend for their state convention as delegates work to set the agenda for the party heading into the November election, with the Senate race and President Joe Biden's re-election bid heavily depending on this key swing state. First Alert Update is a number of speakers address the crowd tonight, including Senator Tammy Baldwin and Governor Tony Evers. The event taking place inside and tonight and tomorrow at Milwaukee's Potawatomi Casino Hotel, coming just 5 weeks ahead of the Republican National Convention, which is taking place in the same city. Democrats are having their national convention this August in Chicago. Because of that, they invited Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker to be the keynote speaker. Governor Evers also saying tonight the party has a good shot at taking seats in the state legislature with new maps in place he signed into law.
Fair maps are now the law of the land, and that means we finally have maps that are fair, responsive, and reflect the will of the people.
Also speaking with Senator Tammy Baldwin, who's seeking a third term, facing a challenge from Republican Eric Hovde. Tonight, she had harsh words for her opponent, who she called out of touch with the people of Wisconsin.
He said single-parent families are on a direct path to poverty and insinuated that single moms have it too easy. Go tell that to a single mom anywhere in our state, working 2 or 3 jobs to provide for her family.
The Republican GOP responding with a statement on the convention saying, quote, the Wisconsin Democrats have sent a clear message with their choice of J.B. Pritzker as their keynote speaker at their convention. Their ultimate aim is to turn Wisconsin into Illinois by satisfying the demands of their out-of-state donors, end quote.